Hey everyone, it's Saturday, September 21st. Raiu and Naraine here with a special episode of the Three Body Problem podcast. I apologize for my voice. This is the morning after LABScon, and I'm sure you know what that means. As a special edition this week, we're going to release the keynote day presentation from Juanito that was presented here at LABScon. It's his thoughts on the state of the industry, and I hope you enjoy.
Good morning, everybody. Well, afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I don't usually get nervous about talks. I think I have gotten used to shielding behind like the technical stuff, but this time I feel like we need to have a really different kind of conversation, and I hope that you'll indulge me in doing some of that. So, first of all, I'm going to say up front what this talk is not. Can you guys set the clock, please? I'm going to forget. I'm going to run right past it otherwise. Thank you. So what this talk is not, it is absolutely not a criticism of SentinelOne at all. And I mean that, like, it's not just because they're nice to me, but honestly, between the conference organizers, S1 allowing us to do this the way that we do, Tomer, Iran, Chris Krebs, Steve now, and my whole team, there's been like this unwavering faith and support and willingness to like embrace my vision even when it doesn't necessarily look that obvious or right, and I'm infinitely grateful for that. So I really don't want you to come away with that. It's also not a criticism of anyone here. I love all of you. You're all my friends. I want to talk about the industry as a whole. And similarities to other vendors, let's pretend they're coincidental. In some cases, I'm sure some of those sharp jabs might hit somewhere, but also, this is not a cry for help. I'm fine. I have a therapist and psychiatrist. My meds are fine. We're all good. I swear. Really. But I feel like we need to have a difficult conversation as an industry. And this is not just for the TI folks. I think in some ways it's going to touch, I hope it's going to touch on everybody here, including you, sneaky VCs in the back, and our kind journalist friends. The truth is, like, I have a really interesting relationship with this industry. I tend to think of, I've spent, the past 10 years almost singularly devoted to this notion of threat intelligence, of tracking APTs and trying to figure out what the best methodology should be and how we should be doing our work and how we can do it better, and saying dumb things on podcasts and tweeting things I shouldn't tweet and pissing people off, some of whom would like me fired, not at S1, other competitors, whatnot, government folks, whatever. But I really do love what we do. And I think of CTI as a form, I like to think of it as art, which I think is really self-indulgent, but no, in reality, I think of it as like the peak of R&D in our space, right? It's in the sense of, you are doing research for its own sake, you solve some interesting problems in ways you had never thought of before, and it sparks some amazing new tool. It sparks an entire different data set that people didn't know how to use. And that's what you're seeing today in a notion of threat intelligence more broadly defined. I'm also really grateful for my successes, and honestly, this alone, like seeing all of you here, having this space, having this conference, I am incredibly lucky, incredibly happy and rewarded just by seeing all of you, my friends, and for the kind of work that we do. And I promise this is getting somewhere. I'm not just like crying myself off stage. So this has been the thing that I've been single-mindedly devoted to. Like those of you that know me well, you know what I mean by that. Like there's no weekends, there's no nights, there's no whatever. This is just what I like to do. And I'm sure that'll lead you all to some conclusions about burnout, and you're not wrong. But that's not the whole thing. I found immense joy in all this. But recently there's been this void. And the more I've talked to a lot of you, the more I've started to realize that I'm not the only person that's trying not to look at this void somewhere in the corner of my eye. And to be fair, it's caused me a lot of like inner turmoil. You can call it a crisis of faith in the industry. And of course, in good human fashion, I've avoided it the way that we do with things that make us uncomfortable. So of course, as I'm pressured to like put together a talk and say something that's actually worth people's time, I said, oh, well, why not just jump straight at this thing that is causing me so much discomfort and that I suspect is causing other people a lot of discomfort. So enter the void. And by that I mean that, frankly, I could not find meaning in anything. It was a form of like, it's not just me having a crisis, but rather, why are we doing what we do? What's the point of publishing what we publish? What's the point of the IOCs? Who's even applying the YARA rules anywhere? What are we writing for? What are we trying to court marketing for? You can see some of those themes of sort of like a general displeasure with what we're up to. And it just felt like this kind of like event horizon for all meaning. Everything was just sort of sinking into it. And if you want proof that it's not just me sort of coming up here to be melodramatic, I've been having this like complete writer's block. I'm sure like Lorenzo must hate me by now, but more than just like what's happening with that book project that we don't talk about. If you guys remember last year, I still haven't published the paper for that talk. So you have this sort of sense of like cynical anxiety and disappointment, and some of you have probably heard it on the podcast, amongst other things, and seen it in how I talk about Brad Smith sometimes and whatnot. Could it be peak burnout? Sure. But I think it's also this sort of sense of ambivalence. And that's a term that I've gotten very fond of lately, which is this notion of loving and hating something at the same time. So, yes, I'm sure burnout is a factor. We will take care of this. That's why Steve is going to make me do it. He's a very strong man. But the truth is that there's also an undercurrent of fear, and I think that whenever you're afraid of something, there's always something a little deeper in there that you need to check. For some reason, I found myself thinking back to this book. There's a book called The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. Some of you know that I am afflicted by having been a philosophy student, and I can't seem to get over that. And most people don't bother with philosophy, and that's fine. You're fine. But those of you that do know a bit about it, everyone will know sort of Aristotle and Plato and whatnot. But what we don't realize is for a long time, the only access civilization had to, like Western civilization had to Aristotle and Plato and the Greeks and all that, was this man Boethius, who translated all those himself and had a wonderful life and was extremely accomplished. And then something political happened, and he ends up in prison waiting to be executed. And in that time, he writes this book. And the idea is that he talks to philosophy as a muse, and it enlightens him about his predilection and, the things that are valuable in his life. And when I picked the title for this talk, I guess I was sort of thinking about that, right? I was looking for consolation in threat intelligence somehow, that things still had meaning and that what we were doing was valuable and meaningful. And I swear to God, this is not going to be like an ultimate downer, but it is a difficult conversation. So, fuck it. Let's stare straight into the void and sort of try to characterize what's going on. I really want TI to have meaning again. I really want the stuff that we do to feel meaningful. But this isn't just my crisis of faith. Like, I think in many ways we're seeing a lot of our support systems fail, a lot of companies restructuring over and over again, reorganizing teams, just suddenly firing entire teams of researchers whom we know are super valuable, irreplaceable in what they do, and those companies will regret it, but it doesn't matter in that moment when you suddenly decide to cut a bunch of talent by the numbers. And there is that ambivalence of value, which is to say that it isn't just me in some weird depressive funk, but rather that many times, many of us here will sit down and go, you tried, you sort of chip at the stone with, you chip at the mountain with a spoon and maybe something will happen, but sort of deflated. And that sort of fear, it made me start to think, at first it kind of like let it fester a bit, got in my head about it, but it also made me think about like, what do we need to sort of transform in CTI? What do we need to reconsider about what we're doing? And what kind of control would we actually need to get to a different place? And that notion of control is going to be a theme that we kind of need to think about a fair amount, right? There's the existential questions. What is our value? What do we do? What are we adding to the world? What's the whole point? What's the contribution of information security when we all seem to think that it's impossible, that we don't seem to accomplish anything, that every company is going to get hacked tomorrow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a temptation to turn away, as in all things, as a proper, hero's journey. But really, what I wanted to ignore was this growing sense of disenfranchisement. And for those of you that are not familiar with that word, like disenfranchisement, I think is sort of the peak term as to what's happening in our space. You have collected all of this brain trust, the smartest people that we have in the industry to do CTI, to do vulnerability research, to do all kinds of really exquisite things, and somehow manage to have those people have the least say in what's happening in this space. And that notion of disenfranchisement, I think, is growing as sort of this like festering satisfaction of what we're up to, and it's easy to turn that into the idea that what we do doesn't have impact and it doesn't have value, which is patently not true. It feels that way sometimes. So we need to address this sort of like lack of leadership and our misplacement in some of these totem poles and some of the things that we're doing that are causing this. It's not just like this is being inflicted upon us, right? We all have a role in all of it. And in part, what we're going to see is what we're going to continue to see is sort of this mass consolidation, right? All the companies we liked and care about, the products we care about, they're all getting, bought up by mega corporations, which are basically graveyards, right? Like most of those companies disappear in a matter of, months or years. The products that we use, that we like to use, RIP Passive Total, for example, will just vanish, right? A company buys it to make it better, and then it disappears. Cool, awesome. This notion that somehow what we lose gets replaced by the next best thing. Look, Validin's here, Silent Push. Yes, there are other companies. There is innovation. I'm glad. But there is no one-to-one corollary between the things that we are losing and letting fall into the sea and the things that we subsequently get or need. That also applies to data sets for those of you that are talking to some of those wonderful privacy lawyers and people that are sort of overreacting to some of these things. That notion of disenfranchisement, in particular, I think sort of shows where we need to go with some of these. Which is sort of taking the reins, taking control back over the things that we're doing, and our role in some of this space. So of course, as any person in a kind of existential crisis does, I took a pilgrimage. I went to Brooklyn, of all places, the ancient borough of Brooklyn, and just sat somewhere with somebody far smarter than I and sort of discussed all this. Really sort of put it all out there. And there were some really interesting ideas, right? Like we talked about how we could reconsider all of information security in the way that like information theory used to discuss it, which is a topic that I brought up in the Virus Bulletin keynote this past year. And there's a bunch of other ways that we could kind of attempt to court expertise from other spaces and reconsider how we're going about InfoSec. But that conceptual turn is not going to do it alone. And I think that's important to sort of realize that we're not going to think our way out of this problem alone. Part of the problem we've got is that our scope has gotten sort of so shrunk to such a critically small point that what we do doesn't make sense anymore. By that I mean, our research is interdisciplinary work. It's supposed to be broad scoping. It's supposed to be cross-functional. It's supposed to be data-driven. It's supposed to show us things that we didn't know were there that should serve as a bulwark against the delusions that we give ourselves when we try to make decisions. And the more we say, hey, you can't talk about China because we have Chinese manufacturing, so if we talk about their APTs, which quite rightly we should, maybe they're going to stop making our iPhones or whatever. I understand, but here we go with sort of this chilling effect, right? Don't talk about the cloud companies, right? We depend on them. We work on them. What if, one of them decided to like 5x our prices because we're criticizing them? Oh, okay, so not the cloud companies either. And you go, well, there's, don't talk about anything that is against what the government might be trying to do, right? So, okay, we're going to keep curtailing. And eventually what you end up with is a very expensive team of researchers that has next to nothing to say. And somehow we start having conversations about what the value of having these researchers is, what the value of paying for tools is, what the value of these investments actually are. And the answer is, well, next to none. And you go, doesn't sound right? Like, I get what you're saying from a business standpoint, but it doesn't sound right. Eventually, my much smarter friend actually gave me a much greater sense of clarity in what was going on, and it was sort of this notion of, okay, we need to kind of take the reins back on this. We need to protect what we're doing, we need to guard our industry, but also, more importantly, we need to reinject value. And the reason I keep coming back to this term value is, like, I'm going to state it in sort of like the simplest iteration I can consider. The value of securing an asset cannot be greater than the value of the asset itself. That is never going to pay off for us. And right now, the question I ask you is, what is the value of information? If we're in the information security space and we cannot assign value to information, then everything we try to provide is an externality and an unnecessary expense that if I can replace it with a checkbox, right, cyber insurance, or, hey, yeah, I bought the worst version of these 7 tools, we're good. Because, hey, they think they're going to lose the information anyway, so what does it matter? Then, of course, security becomes defaced and unnecessary. That means we need to reintroduce that notion of value. I think we also need to reintroduce the notion of quality, but we'll have that discussion at some other time. As we went forward in this, a notion kind of started to crystallize, which in some ways it feels very obvious, but it is a return to what we should have always known or have always known threat intelligence to be, which is a part of intelligence proper. And that, my first VB paper, it's what 10 years ago, Ethics and Perils of APT Research, subtitle being something along the lines of a transition to intelligence brokerage. We all became intelligence brokers overnight, and none of us wanted to accept that notion, at least not in the private sector. And, it shows. But there are a lot of lessons that we need to take on from intelligence as far as rigor goes, competing hypotheses, being data-driven, having decomposable conclusions, and making recommendations for actions that we take on the basis of that information. There's also a bunch of lessons from the intelligence community we do well to unlearn. We'll go into that in a bit. But for the most part, I think if we could just focus on this notion that we need observability, we need context, and we need to provide recommendations, we are doing interdisciplinary, cross-functional work, then something kind of opens up, which is the notion of gaining control by the virtue of the contributions that we can make. We need to break out of that scope that's been put upon us, wherein we shouldn't talk about elections, we shouldn't talk about the Chinese, you don't want to talk about persecution of ethnic minorities, you don't want to talk about the use of O-days by Western countries, you can't talk about any number of things. I don't even know how people are publishing these days. How many talks became off the record in the past 2 weeks on this agenda? So there is that notion of prioritizing quality and sort of being our own arbiters of what we should be doing here. But I think to make a very sort of long, concerning existential crisis succinct, enough to fit in like a Snapple container, What's really missing, the reason that there's that void is that we have been removed from our subject of study. We're no longer a part of that equation. We don't control what comes out, how it comes out. We can't recommend things. We can't tell stories the way that they're meant to be told. So we're not getting to contribute. And in many ways, we are failing ourselves too. Because as an object of sort of study, as a discipline, where are our journals and the things that we write for each other? Where are the sort of methodological and tooling discussions and contributions that are meant to support other people in this community, that are not for the publication, that are not for the marketing kudos, that are for the sake of advancing this discipline? And in that same vein, if we had those, maybe we'd have a place to be able to say, your $3 billion RSS reader, it's not much of an intelligence anything, is it? It's just we can all stop pretending. So there's very much purpose there. And frankly, I think there's a lot of purpose that we could be injecting back into the business. I don't think we need to tell people to invest massive amounts of money into something that has no apparent business value. What we need to show is the amount of business value that what we do can have when it's allowed to function in that way, not just in the public setting, right? Who among you, like many of the people here would also be the best to be doing, I don't know, analytics on the logistics of how our companies function and where certain things are missing and what user engagement and how it works and what sort of behavioral. I'm thinking a lot about Chamath Palihapitiya's team at early Facebook, right? You put a bunch of data analysts and intelligence folks in a room and just go, well, how are people using this thing? And it turns out you can make some pretty amazing stuff happen. And then it becomes really terrible. Anyways, I digress. So we kind of need to rebroaden our scope, and frankly, I mean, I'm not just telling you all to like go get fired, right? Like that's not. I know that that's kind of my thing, but I'm just going to keep pushing and see when it pushes back. But that's not the point. I think more than that, we have played the role of the autists in a back corner somewhere, doing cool stuff, disconnected from the rest of the company, the rest of the industry, the rest of the world, for a little too long. And we've allowed it to creep into our thinking about things. And I think it's sort of interesting because it's affected our definition of what we do in some ways. I hear that, well, in a really tragic way whenever I'm talking to folks who have really critical data for life-sensitive things that we're dealing with, who just can't be bothered to share because it's inconvenient, or folks that are handling massive problems on their own platforms who choose to not take care of it and just let somebody else deal with the problem, which is what happens a lot. I see Stick in the crowd and a lot of the folks over here that tend to pick up the brunt. There's a lot of ways in which you're just kind of sidestepping that. But also, I think I said there's intelligence habits that you need to unlearn. We need to unlearn. And it comes more from like the first generation of CTI people who like had just walked out of the IC. But like, look, man, keeping people's secrets is important and it's good. And they're important, valuable secrets. Keeping secrets for the sake of keeping secrets is a fantastic way to seem useless. I know for a fact people in this room in the past 3 years have helped stop global crises, have gotten probably hundreds of millions of dollars back from certain situations. They've helped with hostage rescue. They've helped with massive espionage implications. There's all kinds of situations that the people in this room have quietly worked and improved, and you've let somebody else take the credit, and that's okay, except when that also starts to affect the notion that our employers and our industry writ large has of what we contribute. And in this day and age, and I'll point you to a different keynote, but the Cyber Threats UK keynote from this year, wartime changes the ethics and the operating procedures for how we go about our craft. And all of a sudden, things matter a whole lot more. That's something to keep in mind with that sort of static notion. So what I invite you to do with me is to kind of brave some of that and start to, let's break out of this notion of CTI, cyber threat intelligence, as IOCs and YARA rules. Let's break out of this idea of, honestly, it's the plumbing. We're still stuck on the plumbing. How is the data moving from one place to the other? What do I care? Why isn't it making it there already? These are engineering problems. They're not CTI problems. And the fact that I need to go look at a blog to find that. Anyways, there's many ways in which we're kind of not looking at the right level of this. If I had to be very quick and say, look, we need to move threat intelligence to just being a normal part of intelligence analysis the way that we would normally think about it, to make your skills portable once again. Because tomorrow, I don't know why you would, but if you want to go work logistics at I don't know, Publix? What's the equivalent over here? UPS? Right. It's the same skills. You can still use Synapse for that. So that's good. But frankly, I think there's a call to action element here that I think is important. And I'll say this, as we define this new paradigm, you guys know exactly who I'm talking about, but there's going to be a lot of empty suits and vaporware salespeople who are going to be upset, who are going to want to claw things back to the acronym soup that they sell at RSA. And that's okay. I'm reminded of a sentence from Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which is, at some point, I won't read you this whole thing, but at some point, as a paradigm changes, and everybody starts to convert to this new paradigm, the folks who continue to resist after the whole profession has converted are ipso facto no longer scientists. And in our case, I think we can think of plenty of examples of folks we love who are no longer analysts. And that's okay. They shouldn't be the ones defining how our industry operates, what it contributes, where it can go, what it can say. It's clearly, they don't know where to take it, and we're all suffering for it. I do want to steal a couple of minutes, and Courtney doesn't kill me, but there is a new role for everybody there. I've talked a lot to the researchers, and I'm talking sort of the analysts, and look, honestly, the biggest work is going to be on us, but there is a role for the VCs, for the journalists, for academia, and for the government to play. And I think that it needs to be just as much of a come-to-Jesus moment for most of those roles. Journalists will cut you some slack, not because I want good coverage, but I really would probably prefer you don't cover this talk. But actually because I know your industry is its own kind of madness at this point. But I will say that it's up to you to keep us honest. And you know that we're pitching you for coverage. And we really appreciate good coverage when we have a cool story. I do think to some extent there needs to be bad coverage when somebody's trying to court and use you. You know it. Just peddle some nonsense. Anyways, you are just as much of a bulwark in our space as we are. Government, love you guys. We're trying to support all of you. Some of you make it extremely hard. Extremely hard. And there are things, look, we've spent the past 2-3 years raging outside your doors trying to help you. At some point, some changes need to come from the inside that we just cannot do. We're not going to fix classification. You probably won't either. But also, just the back and forth, the information sharing, the working together element of this has to be re-injected. And to the intelligence community in particular, not that any of you are here, at some point, if this is the kind of work you want to see, you're going to have to find ways to also support it. It can't just keep materializing for free out of nowhere. We want it to, but apparently it can't. Finally, to the VCs, friends, guys, our industry is running out of tools. It's running out of development power whatsoever. The ones that were created were built, thankfully there are some bootstrap companies, and I love seeing the sponsor list for how some of these have played out. But anywhere that we see sort of the involvement of big VC capital, it's a drive to move away from hard tech problems, which is all of our problems, and to try to follow in a hype cycle that has no payoff. None of those companies are doing well. None of them are doing well. They all end up at Thoma Bravo getting cut to pieces and somehow attempting to resell 4 times. Like, at some point, you have to accept that that doesn't work. Everybody here is a golden geese of some sort. There are people here who solve problems overnight that would be companies in the 8, 9 figures of valuation. They're terrible business people, as you can tell. We need help. You need somebody who can write a contract and do an invoice and actually negotiate something for a better price than what it costs them. Looking at you. Because it's important, because we actually need it, because that's actually how we're going to solve some problems instead of sort of reselling the same crap 10,000 times. So I'm going to leave you with one phrase, which was sort of like the end of this, rumination, which is that at the end of the day, we have to serve as reality checking as a service. Take that for what it means in a public scale, in the politics side, with our companies, with our businesses, with our own industry. But there is a very critical role that all of you play. And it's about time that we start re-injecting that back into the conversation, because this is getting really uncomfortable. And in that super high note, there's tons of you that I want to thank, but I'm super over time, and I don't want Mission Control Barbie to boot me. So thank you all. Thanks to Flux for all of the pictures. Busy, everybody.